When we shoot raw images, we're telling our camera not to apply any editing via the camera's own software, which it would do if we were shooting JPEGs. When we do shoot raw images, it gives us a very large editing latitude, but it does mean that every image is probably going to need some color, contrast, and clarity. Now let's start with this image here. I'll double click to open that up into Adobe Camera Raw. Now the good news is that it's never as hard as we often perceive. Let's make a start with these sections, light and color. The editing we need to do in Adobe Camera Raw consists of balancing the exposure, color, clarity and contrast across the image. But it also includes a lot of personal judgment and choice, because photography is an art. There is no set sequence for use of these sliders in any of the panels on the right-hand side. As we go through them, there's going to be many times when you feel the need to return to a previous slider to readjust it. That's all quite normal. Editing is a number of small steps. And it's only when we see a number of those steps all together that we can see how far we've come. One thing to remember with any of these sliders, whatever we do with the sliders, we can easily get back to where we were just by double clicking that little arrowhead there, and it'll snap back to the default position. But if you've done a lot of work, and I'll just move these all the way down. If you've done a lot of work and you don't want to click around all of those sliders, here's a little tip. Click the auto button and you'll get the auto settings. Click it again and you'll go back to the start. So here we may need to do a little cropping. I'm going to pick up my crop, make sure the padlock is unlocked. I'm looking down at the bottom left corner to see if I can get rid of that little cross piece there, which is a bit distracting. So if I can come up a little bit at the base and maybe in a little bit there, that's looking good. Now that's left me a little bit of a distraction right at the top corner, so that may induce me to just drop that crop down a little bit, and maybe a little bit from the right hand side, a little bit fussy down that edge. So maybe if we just come in a little bit there, I'm happy to start from, hit the enter key, and we can think about what we need to do next. Now, one of the issues we have to address quite often, sometimes more so than others, is color balance. There's a number of ways we can do that, but probably my favorite is with the white balance tool. If I select that tool, I need to look at the image and try to find a location where the tonal range is neutral. Now, what I mean by that is if we look at this area on the ceiling of each of those balconies, my guess is that area should be white. Now, when I click that, there's a change in the temperature and tint. I'm going to hit Ctrl Z. If you look over to the right hand side at the temperature and tint, it's not a massive change because the color balance is not too bad here, but when I click it, you can see the change. Now that does not mean that we can't use that as a starting point. For example, if I wanted to increase the warmth of the image, I could then manually maybe tweak it a little more to the right. But that's more personal. This is correcting the color balance for us. I'm probably going to want to put quite a bit of vibrance in here. What's the difference between vibrance and saturation? Well, as I read it some time ago, vibrance takes account of colors in the image which are already vibrant and tries to bias those less than the ones that need the color. That's the theory anyway. And saturation is just like a volume control, really. Sometimes I include both changes, but most of the time I get most of my image editing color from vibrance alone. Now, if we look at the building down at the bottom right, we've got quite a highlight where the sun is shining. So if we start our editing by looking at the picture and saying that highlight may be a bit bright, what should I do? Well, let's go to the highlights. Let's drop them down. And you can see that highlight is effectively dealt with. We've got quite a bit of shadow underneath these balconies, so let's go to the shadow slider and let's move that to the right, and we can open up those shadows. Now we've got a whites and a black slider here, and if I move the white slider to the right, making the whites brighter and the blacks darker by moving that to the left, what I'm effectively doing is increasing contrast too. Now as I move that to the right, I can just look up at the top right to make sure that little symbol doesn't come up white at the top, because that's telling me I've gone way too far. So I can come back a bit. And the same with the blacks. If I move it to the left and that little symbol lights up, I have gone a bit too far. But it's a balancing act. Sometimes we can have that come on and not worry too much, because we can look at the image and see the shadows are not blocking up very much. We've probably got a little bit around the edges of the ceiling there, but they're not significant and they're not doing any damage to the image. I'm going to come down to the effects. I'm going to include the effects in with the light and the colour, because clarity is like a mid-tone contrast, and if I step it up as you look at the picture, you can see it often adds a nice bit of, well, clarity. Exactly what it says on the slider, and sometimes even a little dehaze. Now what I'm doing here, as I've said and I will say many times, they're probably more personal than absolutely essential. But we've got an image which we can now open up into Photoshop. Now in this case, let's assume there's no extra work we need to do which is exclusive to Photoshop. So all I would need to do here is to save this as a JPEG. I would be saving it with a compression level of 12, which is the maximum, and I would be placing this in onto my finish drive in the current year and month. Now in the interests of speed and my convenience while making these videos, I've done something completely different to what I normally do. I put my JPEG in the folder alongside the raw file, and you can see now the reason why it's probably an idea to separate them, because together they do look remarkably similar. But here we can quickly see that this is a raw file simply by the extension here, the fact it's showing us that we've got some edits in Adobe Camera Raw by those two symbols. And of course we can easily tell this one by the fact it's a .jpg. But of course I have seen some people working with 4 or 5 or even more copies of one image, and it can get confusing. I'd like to open up another image. Let's take a look at another. Let's take a look at this one. Double click and it'll open straight up into Adobe Camera Raw. Once again, a little bit central in the frame, so maybe the crop on this occasion would be for maybe composition purposes. Let's see if we can improve on that. We don't need quite as much of that sky, so that's not a bad position to be in, I think, something like that. Hit the enter key. Now sometimes when we're doing our editing, it's not a bad idea to just click the auto button. If you look at the sliders below in the light section, you'll see them all change. Now the reason that's a good idea is sometimes it'll give you a pretty good result, and it's done so here. But even if it doesn't, it gives us a starting point. We can use it like a preset. We can be safe in the knowledge that Photoshop is not going to move these sliders into a position that's going to be detrimental to the image. So here I could make the decision, for example, that I'd like to kill some of that blue. I want to warm up the temperature. So here it's a personal choice rather than, we could say, a correction, but we can still do a correction if we want to. Once again, we've got the opportunity to consider clarity. We've got the opportunity to consider dehaze. And as I said before, sometimes that means we want to return back to other sliders to make adjustments there. But within a very short time, we've got another image complete. Here I've opened up a batch of images in Bridge. I'm going to select this one to edit because compositionally I think this one's a little bit better. But the horizon's not very straight, so let's fix that. Pick up that crop tool. I'm going to move my cursor outside, click and rotate, looking carefully along the edge there, and that looks pretty good to me. I'll bring that down a little tiny amount, or maybe I can lose a little bit of the base, which may mean I've got to bring that down a bit more. But there we've got good composition. Let's hit the Enter key to commit that change. Now, what's the first thing that strikes us here? I'm not going to go to the Auto button because here maybe we'll learn more by doing this manually. Shadows. The shadows need to be opened up. So I'm going to bring my shadows up. Maybe I'll even bring the exposure up a little bit. Who knows? I may even take it down later on. But look at the boat. The boat now is looking very blue. Well, that's the color balance. So let me zoom into that. Let me switch to that eyedropper tool, because this area in the boat I think should be neutral. It shouldn't be blue, and it's blue because of the time of the day, if I can say it, the time of day that the image was shot. But I don't want to click that panel until I can let you see all of the image. So I'm going to hit Control 0 to fit it all on, but now I'm going to click it, and there you can see the difference when the color balance is corrected, because if the blues are wrong, then every other color in the shot is wrong. Now let me quickly go through the edit here. I may take some of the highlights down. I'm going to take a look at the whites to try to increase the contrast. I'll move that to the right. You can see I can go a long way before that little light comes on at the top right. And I'm looking at the sky, and I don't think it needs that much, but it needs a little, I think. Maybe the black's down a little bit, but we're making the boat a little dark again. So whether that's going to mean we can open the shadows a bit more, we do have a little bit left on that slider. I want to increase the vibrance considerably because this was an evening shot. The sun is getting very low. And once again, we've got water here, so clarity generally works well on water. And if you like the dehaze, you may want to give some of that too. So within a very short time, we've changed this image considerably. Now what I'm going to do here is open this up into Photoshop, because here once again all we would need to do, unless we had anything pressing to do in Photoshop, we would be saving this as a JPEG. But what I want to do is to take you back into Bridge. Now when we view the image in Bridge, it reflects all of the changes that we've put into the raw file, and of course it does make it stand out when we see what it looked like previously by looking at the other few images. But one of the great things about Bridge is this. It's not uncommon, is it, for us to go to a location like this, and I've just peeled off 5 images that were shot at the same place under the same conditions, but quite often I could have 50 images that were shot under those same conditions. So here's something we can do that's going to save a whole heap of time. Select the image we've just adjusted, right click, go to Develop Settings and copy those settings. If we then select all of the other images, and I'm holding the Control key to do that, I can right click, Develop Settings, and I can paste those settings. Now this panel appears because there are other changes that we may have given to one of these images that we don't want to give the others. Things like crops, maybe the healing brush when we get to look at that, and certainly masking. But here everything else is worth taking. So if I just click OK, you can see the effect. Now we can either live with that, but if we wanted to do something with one of these other images, this one for example, we're still working on a raw file. So all we need to do is to open this up into Camera Raw, then we could make our adjustments from there. But already we've got the color balance, most of the exposure, contrast and clarity done. Now, did you notice that in the three subjects we've just manipulated, the similarities between all three? And you're going to discover this is quite common. One last little tip just before we end this video. Go to your vignette, and with an image like this, maybe a little tweak of the slider to the left. See what it does? It just darkens the edges. Now, we don't want to go too far, so anyone who's looking at the picture can actually see the edges, although they're soft. Just go a little way, just to keep those edges down just a touch. Then, of course, we would open up into Photoshop and, of course, save it into the location of our choice. And I'll see you in the next video.